everyone. I'm David Graysboard, and along with the Arizona Center for Judaic Studies, I want to welcome you to this year's Raphael Patai Memorial Lecture. Over many years, this lecture has been made possible by the generosity of the late Professor Patai's family, notably Daphne Patai, Professor Daphne Patai of University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and Dr. Jennifer Schneider, MD of Tucson. So a big thank you to them. Thank you also to Judaic Studies' business manager, Martha Castleberry, and our fearless student workers, Fernanda Charles, Colby Mason, and Esther Sasueta, for their crucial work in setting up this event. Of course, thank you for being here, those of you in the online audience. If you have any acquaintance with the academic study of Jewish culture, you know that Raphael Patai was one of the most important folklorists of the 20th century. His publications cover a very wide range of subjects, including the cultural development of the ancient Israelites, various aspects of Jewish culture and society writ large, and the anthropology of the Near East or Middle East. Patai's pioneering work on gender, especially his book, The Hebrew Goddess, was one of the things that gave me the idea to invite tonight's speaker, Naomi Seidman. Professor Seidman is Chancellor Jackman Professor in the Arts at the University of Toronto. Before joining Toronto, she was a Cord Professor of Jewish Culture, as well as the Director of the Richard Diner Center for Jewish Studies at the Graduate Theological Union in the People's Republic of Berkeley, California. I first met Seidman a long time ago, in the early to mid 90s, I think, when she was an advanced graduate student at UC Berkeley and was teaching at Stanford. And she impressed me as a uniquely gifted, very challenging and accessible scholar and instructor. I dare say there are many, many prominent good scholars. There are very few, in my estimation, very few good teachers, and she's one of them. Seidman's research focuses on the relationship between Judaic cultures, literature, gender studies, translation studies, and sexuality. She's the author of 5 books, and they altogether give you a sense of her Patai-like range. In the interest of time, I'll just mention the last 2 that were published. One from 2016, which is entitled The Marriage Plot, or How Jews Fell in Love and with Literature. The last published book is from 2019. That's entitled A Revolution in the Name of Tradition, Sarah Schenirer and Beis Yaakov. I recommend that title among all the others. Tonight, Professor Seidman is going to draw on her latest forthcoming book, which is currently entitled The Navel of the Dream, Freud's Jewish Languages. That's the official title of this talk, but she has changed it somewhat. Now it's going to be In Freud's Laboratory, Psychoanalysis and Yiddish Research. So she's going to speak for about 45 minutes, to give or take, and then I will open this up to Q&A from you in the audience. Please write your comments and questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom window. So with that said, thank you, Naomi, and take it away.
Thank you so much, David, for inviting me, and thank you to the University of Arizona for hosting me. And it's a great honor to give the Raphael Patai Memorial Lecture. And thank you also for allowing me to switch up the title. It's a smaller part of the book, will be called The Navel of the Dream. And this is the part of the book that's about the reception of Freud among Yiddish speakers. So I'm going to share my screen and jump right into it. Where are we? Here we go. Let's see if I can make that advance. Okay, in August 1930, the New York Daily Forward advertised a Freudian lullaby contest in its Sunday English supplement for a prize of $15 to be paid for the cleverest Freudian lullaby for a Jewish baby. A month later, they reported lullaby contest won by David Greenberger, noting that they had received 1,100 entries from 36 states, Canada, Mexico, and the British Isles. The newspaper published the winning Lullaby, and many of the runners-up in that issue and the next. The lullabies are illuminating as well as entertaining, providing a forum by which the intersection between psychoanalysis and Jewish experience could be explored beyond its usual nexus, Freud's Jewishness. Karl Kraus said, psychoanalysis was the disease of assimilated Jews. Eastern European Jews made do with diabetes. It may have been true that few readers of the foreword, whether in English or Yiddish, could actually afford psychoanalysis, but the context reminds us that these readers were well aware of Freud, the most famous Jew in the world, along with Einstein, and they knew something also about his discoveries. Milton Dickman's knowledge of Freud was particularly impressive. His Lullaby describes a precocious Freudian baby who is suddenly no longer content with the tinkly tune about treetops and the moon that his mother sings to him. Baby said, "Stop." He was really annoyed. "Sing," said Baby, the epic of Freud. It wasn't only Homer that this baby could cite. Dickstein's baby name-dropped psychoanalysts in Freud's circle, even mentioning the now forgotten zoologist Ivan Schmalhausen. The lullaby also invokes the French psychiatrist Pierre Janet, though it mispronounces his name for the sake of the rhyme and misattributes the Oedipal complex to him. And I'll let you read it for yourself. By the time Dickstein's Freudian baby has finished his lullaby, his mother has fallen asleep. Part of the humor of the lullaby is no doubt its commentary on the absurdity of exhausted parents trying to persuade wakeful, talkative children to sleep. But perhaps the lullaby also refers to the intellectual gap that was opening up between a younger generation fascinated by Freud and an older one that preferred to let sleeping complexes lie. But if Yiddish mothers were repressing the Oedipal complex, it may also have been true that psychoanalysts were repressing their Yiddish. The Israeli literary critic Dan Miron relates that in their last conversation before Max Weinreich's 1969 death, Weinreich touched on the tender subject of the New York exile of YIVO, the Vilna-based Institute for the Study of Eastern European Jews that he had co-founded. Weinreich suggested that despite what had befallen Polish Jewry, YIVO's holdings might retain some value in their new home. "I don't know about you Israelis," he said to Miron, "but by now I know my American Jews, young ones included. If American Jews still dream as a group, Yiddish is the language they speak in their dream. It's still the idiom of their collective unconscious. For their personality to become whole, they will have to come back to Yiddish one day. And there we will be, waiting for them down in the Yiddish cellar with a strong flashlight in our hand. Someone will have to spell out their dreams for them to elucidate the vision they saw with bleary eyes. And we, because we made Yiddish the thing we live and die for, we will be able to throw light and heal." Like Freud, whose work he translated into Yiddish, Weinreich saw himself here as a dream interpreter with access to a language that might throw light and heal. Yiddish, for Weinreich, was the language of the collective dream of American Jews, even if they themselves could hardly understand it. To follow Weinreich's thought, we might say that Freud, an acculturated German-speaking Jew of East European heritage, also dreamed in Yiddish, even as he interpreted his dreams and those of others in German. Psychoanalysis shared with many American Jews in Eastern European prehistory, a cellar where half-understood Yiddish dreams played themselves out. If so, the Yiddish reception and translation of Freud's work might help decode Freud's dreams. If collecting and studying Yiddish could clarify the muffled reverberations of Eastern European culture in its American exile, it might also register the echoes of traditional Ashkenaz in the Viennese birthplace of psychoanalysis and its global diaspora. It was not only interpretation at stake in the post-Holocaust YIVO. Weinreich considered American Jews to be suffering from an inner psychic fragmentation fueled by a shame-infused cultural amnesia, despite their material success. An institute devoted to championing Yiddish could reverse this amnesia and heal the shame. Although Weinreich did not say so, the return of Yiddish to the scene of psychoanalysis might have similar therapeutic effects. Among the holdings of YIVO, buried in Weinreich's voluminous archive, is an undated school notebook with the title Freud Laboratoria, the Freud Laboratory, which appears to be a working notebook for Weinreich's translation of Freud's introductory lectures on psychoanalysis. Weinreich's translation of the first 15 of these lectures, I think there were 28, appeared in 3 volumes in 1936, 1937, and 1938. He never completed the translation. Weinreich's Psychoanalyse was the last of 3 Yiddish renderings of Freud's work, and the only one, as the title page proclaimed, authorized by Freud. Beyond this authorization, the Rheinfehr was as close as Yiddish got to its own standard edition. Its status derived from Weinreich's reputation as a scholar of both Yiddish and Freud, and from the institutional imprimatur of YIVO. These circumstances make Weinreich's notebook a multilingual Jewish counterpart to Ernest Jones' 1924 glossary of psychoanalytic terms, which was used by James Strachey to produce the standardized professional jargon that positions psychoanalysis as a legitimate part of the Anglo-American medical sciences. Weinreich had no reason to lend psychoanalysis a scientific patina in a cultural context in which psychoanalysis lacked an institutional presence or clinical aspirations. It's striking then that he no doubt humorously titled his notebook, The Freud Laboratory. In the 1913 exchange in which Freud shared with Ferenczi his worry that psychoanalysis was perceived as a Jewish science, Freud denied the coherence of such a category. Science must be free of the tinge of racial affiliation if it was to count as science. By contrast, YIVO, the Jiddische Wissenschaftliche Organisation, signaled in its name the scholarly aspirations of the organization, its interest in understanding Jews, and its Jewish approach to scholarship or science. Jonathan Boyarin has drawn attention to the grammatical and linguistic distinction between Wissenschaft des Judentum, the science and study of Judaism, written in a non-Jewish language and taking Jews as the passive object of its scientific study, and Jiddische Wissenschaft, in which Yiddish, meaning Yiddish and Jewish, and written in a Jewish alphabet, modifies Wissenschaft, science or scholarship. At YIVO, not only the objects of study, but also the research language, methods, and assumptions were explicitly and openly Jewish. To this day, the relationship between the Jewish influences on Freud and the scientific claims of psychoanalysis remain unsettled. For YIVO, by contrast, the Jewish character of its scientific research was announced as soon as he walked into the front door. The translation of Freud into Yiddish, particularly but not only at YIVO, constitutes a unique set of circumstances within the global dispersion of psychoanalysis. By most standards, the reception and translation of Freud in Yiddish is a minor, short-lived episode in psychoanalytic history. From the geographical perspective, Yiddish was a backwater in this reception history, which is more usually mapped through the dispersion from Vienna to other regions in Central and Western Europe, and then to the United States, Argentina, and many other corners of the world. Yiddish renderings of Freud's writing form a meager late addition to a shelf that was already crowded by the 1920s. Despite this marginality, Yiddish plays a potentially important role in the global history of psychoanalysis by virtue of its place in Freud's family history. It was not only Weinreich who spoke of Yiddish as the collective unconscious of acculturating Jews. The contemporary French psychoanalyst Max Kohn begins his book on Yiddish and psychoanalysis with the more personal assertion that my unconscious speaks Yiddish. That is for sure. Kohn suggests that for Freud too, Yiddish was the language of the unconscious, not as a fully alive vernacular, but as an absent presence at the heart of German Jewish speech. An absent presence that cleared space for the unconscious. German Yiddish translations of Freud thus navigated a particularly dense language border with the complex, politically charged mutual relationships between Yiddish and German, and the stratification of the languages in the post-traditional Jewish psyche. These circumstances were not external to Freud's work, but reflected in intricate ways. Freud implied, most clearly in his book on jokes, that he saw Yiddish as a kind of marrow of Jewish identity, the language obscured behind the European facade of acculturating Jews. At least in the early writings, Yiddish appears as grotesque, degenerate, laughable jargon. And in this way, his references reflect a larger narrative of modernity in which Jews were expected to achieve integration by abandoning their backward Jewish vernacular for European tongues. But we know that the story didn't end there. Yiddishism reversed the hierarchy of German over Yiddish, claiming Yiddish as a language in its own right, rather than a mongrel jargon. Yiddish, in some sense, had the upper hand, preserving linguistic strata of German that had otherwise been lost. In other words, Yiddish could illuminate not only the deep history of Ashkenazic Jews, but also that of their Christian neighbors. Yiddish knew things that German had forgotten, that were buried in German historical cellars. And if Freud participated in the denigration of Yiddish, he also found a place in the reclamation and championing of Yiddish, serving on the honorary board of trustees of YIVO from 1930 until his death. And he met with YIVO representatives in the last weeks of his life. Yiddishism was not only an ideological revolution, it was also an effective and psychological one, seeking to heal Jewish shame by means of Jewish pride. Yiddishism as therapy and cure for the wounds of Jewish modernity, and psychoanalysis, which was also in the therapy business, thus reveal themselves as intertwined developments. For all that, translating Freud's German into Yiddish was no simple matter. The very proximity of German and Yiddish could lead a translator to assume equivalence when the historical paths of the two languages had diverged. This was the case with the German Bewusstsein, consciousness or the conscious, which both Sarah Lerman and Jud Dudnik, who are Freud's first translators, rendered as Bewusstsein in Yiddish, a cognate term. Weinreich rejected this translation on the grounds that in Yiddish, Bewusst has the more specific meaning of well-known or famous. In its place, Weinreich revived an old Yiddish term, Wissig, producing also Unwissig, Unterwissig, Unwissigkeit, etc., that refer to the unconscious. Weinreich's term had the virtue of being transparent, Wissen, nicely distinct from German, and archaic, mimicking the unconscious in its reach down to an earlier stratum of the language. As ingenious as this solution was, it didn't take. Uriel Weinreich's 1968 bilingual Yiddish-English, English-Yiddish dictionary provides both Bewusst and his father's Wissig as equivalents for the word conscious. And in the 1971 Yiddish book on Freud and psychoanalysis by the Buenos Aires Yiddishist psychoanalyst Moshe Kijak, I believe the last book in Yiddish to be written on psychoanalysis, Kijak reverts to Bewusstsein and Unbewusstsein. If Yiddish is the Jewish unconscious, what should we make of the evidence that Yiddishists can't figure out how to express the concept of the unconscious in this language? Despite this fundamental uncertainty, by the time Weinreich set out to translate Freud in the mid-1930s, Yiddish had developed a consensus on at least a few psychoanalytic terms. The most interesting of these were those that sought distinctively Jewish ways of expressing Freud's thought. Yiddish writers on psychoanalysis may have avoided German cognates and mobilized the Hebraic component of Yiddish as part of their declaration of independence from German and demonstration that Yiddish was had the capacity to render the most sophisticated ideas the world had to offer. But they also used the Jewish Yiddish to render shocking psychoanalytic ideas more palatable to Yiddish readers. That is, to overcome the resistance to psychoanalysis that Freud's ideas encountered everywhere, even among Jews. A 1931 article by the psychologist Tzadi Rudi thus assured his readers to get over their distaste for words like libido, since sexuality or libido is simply what the Jewish vernacular calls the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. Other translators also mine the Volkssprach, the folk language, to render Freud's thought. For libido, Dudnik has niyuf or taiva, kind of religious terms for lust. And for trieb, Weinreich's Freud laboratory lists both trieb and yetzer. For libido, he has libido, but also cheshek. All these are very rabbinical terms for those of you, I don't know who's there, who might have an air for rabbinical Hebrew. The further Yiddish translators moved from German, the more powerfully they illuminated what was obscured in German, the Jewish resonances of Freudian thought. It was in Yiddish, Weinreich insisted, that the force of the S, the id, was exposed as the source of unconscious processes, as in the Yiddish locution, es will sich etwas, not ich will etwas, I want something, but something in me which is not quite me wants something. Strachey's opaque Latinisms, id, parapraxis, might gain psychoanalysis a place in the social sciences, but Freud's Yiddish translators made a place for psychoanalysis within Jewish culture. Yiddish, like Jewishness, was both marginal and central to Freud's thought, a backwater in psychoanalysis that was also its secret heartland. A backwater it was, but it was Freud's backwater, from which he himself, or at any rate his family, had come. The journey from east to west was not only about Freud and his parents. Ambitious young people continued to stream from the eastern provinces of the Austro-Hungarian Empire to Freud's Vienna. The Vienna Psychoanalytic Society included at least 19 immigrants from Polish lands, and its members treated at least some of those Eastern European Jews who were not content with diabetes. For instance, the Rashab, the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was treated by a member of the by Stekel, a member of the Viennese Psychoanalytic Society. Helene Deutsch, the founder of the society, recognized the significance of this circumstance. The Polish lands had given Freud as many disciples as it had because Poland itself was the unconscious of Europe. Exerting its power from the heart of the continent, despite its absence from the list of recognized European states. But even the return of the repressed, which is to say the founding of the independent Republic of Poland in 1918, could not put Yiddish land on the map. Lest one imagine that the psychoanalytic research developed at YIVO was a parochial counterpart to Freud's cosmopolitan universalism, it might be worth remembering that Freud delivered his first lectures on psychoanalysis to his local B'nai B'rith brothers, while Weinreich shared his work on Jewish youth with a group of researchers from 14 different countries, including India, Finland, Norway, Japan, and Turkey. Weinreich began his psychoanalytic research into Jewish adolescence as a Rockefeller Fellow at the 1932-33 Yale Seminar on Culture and Personality, which included scholars from around the world. During the long winter break, Weinreich did research at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, interviewing African-American youth about their experiences of discrimination. He also immersed himself in the work of W.E.B. Du Bois and what could be called critical race theory, much on our minds today, for those of you watching the confirmation hearings, is as powerful an influence as psychoanalysis in his sociological work on Jewish adolescence called The Way to Our Youth. Weinreich's scholarship in that work, published first in 1935, revolved around the central insight that one is not born, but rather becomes a Jew, a process as complex and ambivalent as acquiring a gender or sexuality. It was Du Bois who supplied this insight in his autobiographical description of the shocking moment in which he, quote unquote, became Black, in which he first saw himself as Black through the eyes of a white playmate. Du Bois wrote, "It's a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in contempt and pity." Jewishness, too, was such a shock, although Weinreich suggested that the initial shock of Jewishness was almost always suppressed. As with the development of sexuality, the crisis had two stages. The first, which occurred roughly at the same time as the Oedipal complex, and generally was unconscious, was a precursor of the second, which defined adolescence. The last element of the structure came from the adolescents Weinreich interviewed at the Tuskegee Institute. For members of persecuted minorities, the shock of Jewishness or Blackness was at least partially alleviated by compensatory mechanisms developed by these marginalized cultures, which supplied the feeling of self-confidence that the dominating culture denied them. In Weinreich's view, Jews had a kind of genius for compensatory mechanisms. Their whole religious history was a robust compensatory mechanism, assuring the relative health of the Jewish ego. Freud himself, along with other quote unquote famous Jews, and this in the 30s was a great decade for lists of famous Jews, and I found many different lists, but without exception, they all had Freud and Einstein on them. Freud himself served as a secular form of compensation through his fame, but Weinreich also contended that these compensatory mechanisms were failing even for religious Jews, precisely when they were needed most, in the darkening shadows of fascism. If, as Yerushalmi memorably said, history is the faith of fallen Jews, Weinreich believed that it was rather ethnography that would stand in the breach, allowing Jews to integrate their present circumstances with a rapidly vanishing past. The project of constructing a theory of just how one becomes a Jew is both an example of the influence of psychoanalysis on Weinreich's thought and a mark of his distance from Freud. Der Weg zu unserer Jugend, The Way to Our Youth, is a kind of funhouse mirror image of Freud's work, as if the act of writing psychoanalytically from right to left rather than left to right, produced a reversal in the gravitational field. While Freud focused on sex, relegating questions of Jewishness to footnotes, Weinreich raised the question of Jewishness from the footnotes into the body of the text, putting remarks about sex that he claimed he didn't have time to adequately investigate in his voluminous footnotes. The analysis of little Hans, a phobic 5-year-old and the son of Freud's friend, is a case in point. Little Hans is afraid of horses. To make a long story short, because of his Oedipal fear that his father will castrate him. Surprise, surprise. But a footnote, which I've produced in its entirety in Freud's case study, provides one of Freud's rare mentions of Jewishness or anti-Semitism. And I'll let you read it here while I take a sip of my cold tea. Let's see what the next one is. I hope that was long enough. Did you get that? In place of a foot, yeah? Should I go back? In place of a footnote on anti-Semitism, Weinreich produced a treatise. This treatise also takes an interest in childhood phobias, in particular, the well-known Jewish fear of dogs. When and how does that fear begin, Weinreich wonders, theorizing that Jewish parents communicate their own fears to the babies they are carrying, and so the babies learn, through a shift in pressure or a quickening of the breath, which streets and neighborhoods are theirs, that is Jewish, and which belong to the Gentiles, because only Gentiles had dogs. And horses too are part of the discussion. Weinreich relates a story he heard about 2 Jewish boys who passed a horse and buggy on a Berlin street. The first boy warns the second boy to beware of the hindquarters of the horse, since it might decide to kick. But the second boy isn't so sure. How would the horse know I was Jewish? Such fears, in Weinreich's view, not only shape Jewish consciousness through a bodily transmission from one generation to the next in earliest childhood, they also mark the boundaries between Jews and non-Jews, externalized in the divided city and internal within each Jewish consciousness. These boundaries also persisted. Weinreich claimed that if you wanted to know how Jewish an American Jew was, don't ask them if they know Yiddish, ask them if they're afraid of dogs, which is just a roundabout way of saying that along with his Oedipal difficulties, little Hans might have been suffering simply from Jewishness. Freud too understood the concept of compensatory mechanisms so central to Weinreich's theory of Jewishness. It actually comes up quite explicitly in a letter he exchanged with little Hans' father, Max Graf, advising him against having little Hans baptized. Not that it would help, Weinreich would add. If you don't let your son grow up as a Jew, you'll deprive him of those sources of energy which can't be replaced by anything else. He'll have to struggle as a Jew anyway, so you ought to develop in him all the energy he will need for that struggle. Don't deprive him of that advantage. Freud didn't explain what in Jewish life, lived Jewishly, might provide such sources of energy, but these were laid out perfectly clearly in Weinreich's descriptions of Jewish compensatory mechanisms. YIVO, in aiming to restore Jewish pride through Yiddish Wissenschaft, and Freud, the famous Jew, were themselves just such compensatory mechanisms. That Weinreich was attempting to create a Jewish science, and not merely a science that studied Jews, is evident from the language of his work, which worked to construct a modern technical vocabulary from native Jewish resources. Thus, the word Eifele, infant, from that word Weinreich constructs a word. Yiddish doesn't have a word for infancy, so Weinreich constructs Eifelschaft, which I've translated as little birditude. Weinreich also takes traditional Jewish formulations and wrenches them into jarring new shapes. The most jarring is Weinreich's central insight that Jewishness is experienced as a kind of blow from outside, like blackness. Weinreich calls these blows der erste und der zweite Attack von Jiddischkeit, the first and second attack of Jewishness. Weinreich clearly understood Yiddishkeit in other contexts as expressing Jewishness in the usual positive sense by which Jews praise themselves and their culture. But Weinreich was looking for a word that could do the work of both abstracting the blow that was anti-Semitism and suggesting how deeply and intimately that blow landed. He also believed that anti-Semites were not the only source of the violent imposition of Jewishness, analyzed the violence exercised by any collective on its individual members, and suggesting that the first attack of Jewishness, the one that was fated to be repressed and forgotten, actually begins with circumcision. With such research questions, Weinreich's most persistent concerns and Freud's most persistent obsessions reveal themselves as inseparable dimensions of the same human coin. I'm almost done, David. Okay. So, did Weinreich know things that Freud didn't, or that he was willing to discuss openly and Freud was only willing to discuss in a private exchange? To see Weinreich's psychoanalytic work as a public presentation of the open secret of Jewishness is to miss the extent to which it set the very notion of Jewishness into radical question. It was precisely Weinreich's point that it was no longer possible to say what Jewishness was once the old compensations had turned to dust, once Yiddishkeit itself was exposed as something external to the self rather than its deepest truth. Among the most radical features of Weinreich's work is that he resisted using the word Jew because he believed that the word obscured how much the youth he was studying were a new breed, unknown even to themselves. Parents had nothing to offer these new young people. Why teach children to save when inflation was destroying the value of all money? Parents used to believe that children should be stopped from masturbating, he writes on the first page. But now everyone knows that you should just avert your eyes. Even the title expressed the chasm that separated the older generation from the ones coming of age in a newer and darker climate. If Freud could take a royal road to the unconscious, Weinreich's approach to the youth of Poland followed a rather bumpier path. Yiddish itself, the very language of Jewishness, strained to express new realities and was finally forced to confess that it didn't know what it meant to be a Jew and where being a Jew began or how it might end. It was precisely the point of Der Weg zu unserer Jugend that in it, Jiddische Wissenschaft dug deep enough to find its most intimate subject, which turned out to be an alien self. In the years Weinreich was attempting to rebuild YIVO in New York, he reinstituted his autobiography contest on American soil, asking for reflections on the experience of immigration. But the 1942 contest no longer focused on youth, since YIVO lacked the language and structure to communicate with American Jewish youth. After the prizes were awarded, the entries were deposited in the archive where they rest in peace. Scholars have long sought to figure out how Jewish Freud was, as if knowing the answer to that question would reveal something fundamental about who Freud was, expose the bedrock of a Jewish past, speak truths available only in Jewish languages. Yiddish is the punchline of the joke, the Ostjude, the core of the Jewish self. Having arrived at these truths, the archaeologist can pick up her picks and spade, the researcher can turn in his manuscript, they can put their work to bed for a well-earned sleep. But scholars at YIVO, a few hundred miles to the east of Vienna, were under no such illusions. At YIVO, that punchline, the Ostjude, the Yiddish-speaking Jew, was where the real work began. Yiddish, it turned out, was no bedrock of the Jewish psyche. The ground they stood on was shifting as they built their enterprise, as they sought their scholarly footing. In Weinreff's work, Yiddish itself strained to capture how one became a Jew and what it might mean to be one. Yiddish could become radically estranged from itself, reaching for a scientific vocabulary, even as it tried to remain rooted in traditional meanings. Along with an endlessly generative treasure trove of folklore and rich food and a nurturing past, Yiddishkeit was also the symptom and name for a blow you didn't see coming, a split self, a research project without the time it needed to get off the ground. Thank you.
Wow. I can only say wow for the time being. Let me see if I can make myself visible again. While people collect their thoughts on that extremely, in my view, extremely provocative talk, let me go ahead and ask the first question. In fact, I have many questions, Naomi, but I'll ask this rather simple, straightforward one. And that is, what drew you to Freud? Although I'm tempted to add the footnote that this isn't about Freud. This is about Yiddish or Yiddishist readings of Freud, specifically Weinreich. So tell me what the process was whereby you thought that engaging in Freud as a symbol took you where you've been in recent years.
It's so funny that I've just been writing the introduction to my book, which is finally, getting close to being finished. Maybe I have a pretty close to complete first draft. And I was trying to remember how I got the idea for the book, and I actually can't remember. The one thing that I do know is that for many, many years, I've been collecting old Hebrew and Yiddish translations of Freud. So whenever I'm in Israel and a used bookstore in Jerusalem, I just look for, they show me the new ones. I'm not interested in the new ones. I want the old ones. So I have a little collection of, like, way before I started writing this book, I just had a collection of books of like Yiddish Freudiana. And I also then I realized that I wasn't, it might seem like I was collecting research material to write a book, but I think it's more the case that I was writing a book in order to get the research material. Like, I just wanted that stuff. And because I was so interested in this, everyone in my family and my friends started giving me all these Freudian tchotchkes. So I had the Freudian Post-its and the Freudian, I think they're called Freudian slips. And then I have my son from, my birthday got me the Freudian slippers. So I have Freudian slippers. And I just realized how happy it makes me. So during the pandemic, I was in my family house in Berkeley, and I don't have a home office. So we cleared out a closet for me, and I had everyone was calling it the Freud closet. And I had all my Freud stuff in it. And I think and it reminded me of Freud himself, who had a collection of antiquities, except that instead of antiquities, I had a collection of Freud stuff. So like Freud, I was collecting stuff that connected me to something that I wasn't entirely conscious of what it was. And that's what I tried to figure out, why I had such an attraction to this. And I think one reason that I was so attracted to the Yiddish Freud, and why I'm attracted to Yiddish in general, is that I have 100 books on the Jewish Freud in my Freud closet. And I don't think a single one of them has read a word of this material. Like any of those people who wrote books about the Jewish Freud, even Yerushalmi, who's really interested in how much Freud did how much Freud did Yiddish know? How much Yiddish did Freud know?
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting how many Freudian slips you start making when you talk about all this. For like the longest time, I couldn't say the word that Yiddish was a backwater of, I kept saying a bathwater of psychoanalysis. Anyway, I don't know what to do with that.
Yeah.
But I realized that, you know, you have this like access to something like Freud. To get into Freud studies is like getting into Shakespeare studies. You don't do it lightly. It's not like something that you can just come to. Freud himself wrote, you know, basically a Talmud all on his own. And then all the piles and piles and piles of material that everyone else has written about Freud. And yet there's not a single book about this, which is both, as I fully confess, a very minor episode in the history of the dispersion of psychoanalysis around the world, and also really important for all the reasons that I point out, or that I try to point out. These were people who were in some ways so close to Freud, and Freud knew them. I mean, Freud had communication with these people. As I said, among the last visitors that, you know, that he entertained in his house when he was dying were 3 representatives from the London branch of YIVO. He felt something for Yiddish. And I mean, discovering all kinds of things that Freud said about Yiddish. So that, I think that's partly my, like, okay, I'm not going to read every word that Freud ever wrote, much less every word that Lacan wrote, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then the post-Freudians. But none of those people read this. So it's like, you know how it is when you feel like you have a niche. You have something that, you know, I have my little Freud closet, which is actually a niche.
Sure.
And I feel like it's an important one and a fascinating one to me. I was drawn to it before I understood what it meant.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what you're describing is really a kind of argument in favor of Jewish studies, right? I mean, there are ways, for example, in which Kafka has always been known as a Jewish author, and yet you read the analyses and nobody has the slightest, in my opinion, nobody has the slightest idea what he's talking about. But anyway, I digress. Unless anybody wishes to chime in, please do so. I wanted to ask, really to give you a commentary to which you may wish to respond. And that is that, well, first of all, I'm very drawn to the idea of Yiddish as a collective subconscious, even for people who do not speak it or who do not understand it. This led me to consider that what you are doing, essentially, one of the things you're doing is to explicate the cultural / symbolic dimension of an anthropological / sociological phenomenon that's been identified as the formation of, to use one of the terms you applied, a double consciousness among especially American Jews, whereby religion becomes the facade by which they cultivate their sociability and make themselves legible to other Americans and to each other, right? But in fact, you know, the shuls, the praying, the davening, the seminaries, the clergy, all of these things are really a symbolic ethnicity, a way of enacting an ethnicity that is, in fact, semi-conscious. Yeah, not necessarily the thick ethnicity of Yiddish speakers like I don't know, Zhitlovsky, people like this, but certainly the ethnicity which is not committed to theocentricity, to particular theological proposition, which has already emancipated itself from religious tradition. Yeah, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that. Maybe I'm off base, I don't know.
No, this is exactly what I'm thinking about. I'm actually, my book actually starts with a kind of analysis of why we want to see the Jewish Freud. What is it that we want to connect to in Freud? And what is this thing about wanting to connect to famous Jewish celebrities and trying to figure out if they're Jewish or not Jewish? And you talk about this facade, and one of the things I look at is the fact that the structure that you're describing of a kind of a buried Jewishness that has a kind of facade that doesn't match it is somehow, has a similar structure to Freud's what's called the topographical model of the psyche. So this idea that there's something buried within us that we've lost contact with, but that is a kind of emblem of a deep past. And Freud talks about these the first time he described the unconscious, he talked about it as a room that had these buried multilingual monuments in it. Mm-hmm. And there's a kind of ideology. I thought you were going to talk about the Spanish Inquisition and the crypto-Jewish identity. Oh. So, this kind of idea of the modern Jew as a kind of Marano, like something buried.
Yeah.
And that as kind of the structure by which Freud was understood.
Sure.
And what is it possible that Freud's topographical model of the psyche actually derives from this crypto-Jewish idea of the Jew buried underneath the Christian, mm-hmm. and the Inquisition is a kind of forces you to tell your Jewish truths.
Right.
And the psychoanalyst's couch has a kind, according to Foucault, is a little bit like the Inquisition. And then all these Jewish academics who are trying to catch Freud's Jewishness themselves are kind of replaying this idea of uncovering the Jewish Freud. Mm-hmm. And I think that what I'm doing is not so much participating in this game as trying to show it. I think we're at a point where we can sort of see the limits of it because we're at a different moment in Jewish identity, mm-hmm. politics, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, there's much to say to all of that. I'm wondering, I don't want to hog the camera, so to speak.
But I think if people had questions, they would put something in. Doesn't nobody have a question out there in Zoom land?
Or just a comment. We have a rather august group here of some of my colleagues, former graduate students, etc. Again, while they think of possibilities, let me just say, I imagine that what you're doing vis-a-vis Freud and Weinreich is a little bit like what many people have done vis-a-vis Spinoza. And I always argue, look, you don't call him Benedict, don't call him Baruch, because that is ahistorical. He was, in the streets of Amsterdam, he's probably called Bento, which was the Portuguese, right? But leaving that aside, that's my historian's gripe. But leaving that aside, I mean, there's a very sort of, you might say, swashbuckling attempt by Yirmiyahu Yovel to show that he is, in essence, the first modern, in as much as he is a converso. Now, let's leave aside that he wasn't a converso, he was the child of conversos, etc. And then, of course, there's a very famous, let's say, re-Judaicization of Spinoza by the likes of Ben-Gurion, in order to build a national project. And I'm wondering to what degree you think, if any, you think that this kind of melancholy rebuilding of Jewishness, a la Weinreich, is maybe a broader theme in modern Jewish life, particularly European Jewish life.
I do think so. I mean, we're talking about a kind of persistent fascination and identification with crypto-Jews that, and also this, the question of who is it that makes the crypto-Jew really Jewish? Is it themselves? Is it the Inquisition? Mm-hmm. Is it the Jewish studies scholar that kind of brings them back into the fold? I'm actually, one of the things that I've been thinking about just over the last week or so I'll bring it up now, is trying to trace how this game has changed and why, and how it is that we can now see the game so clearly. In the 1980s, there was a Saturday Night Live episode called Jew, Not a Jew, about where you had to guess if a Jewish celebrity was Jewish. It's like a game show and Tom Hanks is the host. Michael Landon, somebody. And yes, born Eugene Horowitz in Brooklyn, New York. And that was what the game looked like then. And now there's actually a website or whatever it's called on Instagram called Hey Alma, which is a kind of Jewish women's thing, where they play a game that's also called Jew, Not a Jew. But it's really clear that what they're trying to do is they're not trying to expose the Jew Michael Landon. They're trying to expose the Jew who's scrolling through Instagram for their Ashkenazo normativity or Ashkeno normativity, however you say that. So they're always putting on Black Jews or Mizrahi Jews or Jews that don't have like typically Jewish names. So you see most of these celebrities, I don't have no idea who they are. So I see, I see an African American. I think, oh yeah, well that guy must be Jewish, right? And the point is to turn in other words, that game turns the gaze back at me, what my biases are and what my assumptions are. And I think that there was something very, very sexy and exciting about the Jewish studies, the search for the Jewish Freud in the 1990s. It was part of queer studies and post-colonial studies. It was an attempt to show that Freud's not a dead white European male. He's an interesting Viennese Jew with all kinds of sexual anxieties. But now it's like that insistence on the Jewish Freud, it just suddenly seems outdated. And so I was collecting all these books and realizing that by the time I got around to writing the book, there was something like unappealing to me about it, if that makes sense. So actually my last chapter is called The Jewish Freud in an Age of Black Lives Matter, where I try to wrestle with some of these. Why do we want, what is this kinship that we're always trying to find? The guy, and it's all over Freud too. Freud has all these Jewish jokes where people are like, the acculturated German Jew comes into the train car with the Galicianer, and there's so many jokes that have that structure, but we're playing that game too. And what that game does, it's now obvious, it excludes Mizrahi Jews, it excludes, and it always did. I mean, Primo Levi talks about how no one in Auschwitz believed he was Jewish because he spoke Hebrew with a funny accent and he didn't know Yiddish at all. So what it does is it excludes Jews of color. There's something about the game that really needs to be interrogated, not the hiding Jews. The crypto Jews turn out to be a fantasy and a wish as opposed to a suspicion.
Right.
If that makes sense.
You remind me, apropos of your assertion in characterizing Weinreich, the Weinreich's position that Jewishness is kind of the adoption of an alien self. You remind me of something I learned rather late in my career as a Sephardicist, that American immigrants from Turkey, from the Balkans, Sephardi Jews, referred in English to the Ashkenazic Jews as Jews, and they call themselves something else.
The nation. Right?
Yeah, something like, well, among other things. Yeah, I mean, depends on the sub community, but yes, that's sort of like a double or a triple self-alienation, which in many ways, I hesitate to use this term, but Maronizes the particular permutation of modern Jewishness. I mean, Maronism is something which makes me, as a concept, it's something that makes me wince a little bit, just because I want to anchor it in something that's historically true. But I think it's of course very, as an idea, it's very suggestive, particularly as we look at modernity and the dilemmas of having to build compensatory mechanisms to compensate for the inability of the existing compensatory mechanisms to compensate,
Right. By the way, Freud was super fascinated, like so many other people, with Maranism, to the point that he taught himself Ladino. And he and his friend Edward, who called himself Eduardo Silberstein, wrote each other letters in Ladino.
Wow, this I didn't know. You know, I mean, among German Jews, the romance, the
Right.
mystique of the Sephardim is sort of is well known, but I didn't know this particular aspect of Freud's biography. So anyone else? It's 8:01. We are technically at an end, but I mean, I feel like all these brilliant people on the call haven't.
They're stunned into silence, or else they're asleep. You know, that's what happens when you start your talk with a lullaby.
I guess so. Let's see.
Somebody did raise his hand. David.
Okay, wonderful.
Somebody.
I don't see it. I don't see anything in the Q&A or in the chat. Maybe.
I did see that somebody raised their hand.
I thought, yeah, here we are. Okay, David. Okay, David, I'm going to allow you to talk.
These people or no?
Sure. David is one of my favorite people. So go ahead, David.
Oh my God, David. Hi.
Hi, I'm so sorry. I just sort of found out about this a little bit late, and I came in late, but I loved everything that I heard tonight. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
I just couldn't resist the temptation to mention that when I was at the University of Arizona, I took a class on Freud, and what I was interested in was this moment in which he uses the word shibboleth, and I was like, that sounds a little bit Hebrew to me. So I just looked it up, like, oh yes, indeed. So the shibboleth, you know, the story of having this sort of like password became itself a password into Jewishness for me, and I just wanted to sort of throw that in there for fun.
Oh my God, where does he talk about the shibboleth?
I've blocked out a lot of the things that I learned so many years ago. I'll try to find that again. I
have a PDF of all of Freud's work. I'll do a word search, but that's wonderful. I mean, my field is basically translation studies, or at least my main field, one of my fields. And shibboleth is a hugely fascinating word to a lot of translation theorists. And I can't believe that I have yet to make any hay of Freud's use of the word shibboleth. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
I'll have to thank you in a footnote, which is where all the subconscious of the text is, right?
Yeah. David, I was going to say that maybe you have repressed or suppressed your memory of the course.
Exactly.
Anyway, it's lovely to hear your voice after so long. Okay, anyone else? All right, well, listen, maybe questions will arise as people absorb what you've had to say.
Send me an email.
Purchase the book. Yes, I will definitely, if anybody wishes to get in touch, I can forward questions on. And, before our outreach coordinator left and on maternity leave, it was our custom to send attendees a note saying thank you, and of course, providing any information that they might like to see, to contact the speaker or connect with his or her works. But once again, Naomi, it's lovely to hear you, lovely to see you, and I'm very glad we got to do this. As I said before, ideally at some point we can actually sit down in a room and in one room and communicate more thoroughly. But anyway, thank you all for coming. I'm thrilled that you could make it this late, and our next talk will be by Professor Thomas Kovacs of German Studies here at the U of A. He will be delivering some, I think very apropos impressions on Jewish culture, especially Jewish literature in Germany, or in German culture writ large. So anyway, we hope to see you at that talk. Information about that has gone out today, but I will try to boost it so that everyone here will be apprised of what's going on. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Good night.